Hello and welcome to this channel. Today we're joined by Simply Skeptical to talk about her journey in skepticism. I'm very looking forward to this discussion because this is the first skeptic that we have on this channel. We've talked to philosophers, Christians, atheists, but we haven't really had a discussion about what skepticism means in 2024, of course, going into 2025. So we're very happy to have you on. Simply Skeptical, thank you for coming on this channel. How are you? And can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. Really, I think the best way to start off by explaining what I'm doing here is that I have been questioning for quite a while. I kind of fell away from my faith a few years ago. And as of this year, I've really kind of delved into atheist internet, if you will, and found that it's a pretty dark place. There's a lot of negativity there. There's not much representation for somebody like myself. And I am afraid to take on the title of atheist. Until I do the exploration, I really don't want to label myself in any way. And I think that skepticism is the best way to do that. And my goal really is to encourage skepticism in others. I think that it's a wonderful thing to have faith. I think it's a great thing that you have an identity within a certain faith or religion, but encouraging others to look deeply into that and not just follow the way they were raised or what they believe to be true, but to really question it and make it the most fair way of identifying within a certain faith.
Brilliant, and that definitely is something which I share that sentiment about having to really
Hmm.
inquire and not trying to put yourself into one category or another, because
Yeah.
I think when you go online, you see just too many videos, both on the atheist side, as you talk, but also on the Christian side, where they're like, oh, you have to be a theist, or these are the certain criteria or categories that Christians have to
Yeah.
follow. And sometimes that does actually feel very alienating for the people actually in those categories in some ways, because you look at those categories and you're like, well, I kind of follow maybe sections 1, 2, 3 of them, but then
Hmm.
those 4, 5, 6 don't exactly apply to me. So I definitely feel that and kind of sympathize with that aspect of it. And I was wondering, you just talked about falling away from faith. What was that background in the past that you're falling away from?
Yeah, so I live in the Bible Belt of America. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's just the southern states where Baptist Christianity is most prominent. And that, of course, has a lot to do with American history. But that being said, there's a lot of Baptist churches here. That's what you're going to find most of. And with that, I have a lot of people in my family, a lot of people in my life that I went to school with, that I'm surrounded by, that are of the Christian faith, most likely going to be Baptist or Protestant, but Southern Baptist. And so I was raised in the church. I was a part of the church, and it was never pushed upon me, which I really appreciate. I know a lot of people, their experience is coming from that they had to attend church, they had to believe, and all of that. And luckily, I come from a family that I am welcome to explore, and I can come to them and say, hey, I'm having these questions, or I'm feeling a certain type of way. And with that environment, I do feel comfortable knowing that I'm welcome to explore. And come around middle school, I think a lot of people start to make some realizations, and then leading into high school. And with all of that, I had questions that weren't being answered, or if I did get an answer, it was unsatisfactory. And going through college and coming into an adult, I'm still a young adult, but I realize that I do have the mental capacity to actually explore these things and these ideas that I honestly haven't had before. And coming into adulthood, I want to make sure that I truly do understand these ideas that I'm exploring.
Hmm. So you do raise some of the questions that you're looking to be answered. I'm sure we'll get onto that later on in this video as we exchange ideas and
Yeah.
talk about them. Though I suppose before we get into kind of those questions, I'm very happy that you did feel the kind of the Christian narrative was forced upon you, because I mean I grew up in a Baptist family, Southern Baptist
Hmm.
actually church in Hong Kong. I know
Yeah.
it's kind of halfway across the world in some
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
but it's that was kind of the background I came from. And I mean, I have very wonderful parents who also didn't really force religion on me,
Hmm.
or just kind of allow me to explore questions about faith and religion, also within Christianity as well as outside of Christianity. And I think that's something you've also been exploring with your YouTube channel. I actually came across one of your videos of going, I think, to Catholic Mass once,
Hmm.
and that's something which I think I'm very appreciative of my family for allowing me to do, because if people have been following the channel, I went from Baptist to Catholicism quite
Right.
recently. So that's been quite an interesting development. But perhaps when you're thinking about this idea of these questions, what what kind of motivates your questions, and what are kind of the forms or the stages you take when you're trying to find answers to them? Because of course, when we were young, we want to just ask someone, as you say, and I love asking people. I like talking to the pastor, I like talking to teachers. But now when we get a bit older, we're like, okay, I need to read some books, I need to go find the answers for myself. What's the thought process behind that, and kind of what directions does that take you?
Yeah, so I think you initially touched on that I want to actually find true answers and not just ask the people in my life, because it's very easy to find ourselves in an echo chamber, especially considering where I am and the people that are around me. So I can't just go to my neighbor and ask them. So I think that the way that I'm forming my channel, I've only done one book review so far, and that was from Sam Harris. So he is a notable atheist, right? So I was looking into his book, The Moral Argument, hoping to get some answers, and I didn't really get many answers. But that's kind of where I'm going now. I'm reading C.S. Lewis and I'm reading Mere Christianity. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe he can offer another perspective. And I'm really wanting to make sure that while on my search, that I'm not, like I said, creating an echo chamber. I'm not just looking for somebody to reconfirm what I already think, but somebody that offers a different perspective, and I can kind of pick and choose. And I know that people say that picking and choosing when it comes to religion is not, or cherry picking is not the best way to go. But when it comes to questions like morality, I think that looking at a broad range of ideas and figuring out what works best and fits best into my life is the best way to approach that.
That's definitely very fascinating. You raised two, I suppose, very notable figures in the atheist and the Christian camp. Is there any reason why you chose Sam Harris or C.S. Lewis in particular, or did you just kind of think of them as the best representations of those movements?
Yeah, so really, to be honest, I started off with what really got me started on this journey was reading Christopher Hitchens, which is quite strong. He is, I would say, an anti-theist, so he is very much against religion. And I started reading that, and then I found Richard Dawkins, and I'm like, okay, who are these guys? And started looking them up and realized, okay, so there's these four main characters of the new atheism movement, and from there is when I got into the atheist internet and all of that. So when deciding upon Sam Harris, it was really the first book that I hadn't read yet, and I wanted to read something fresh for my channel. And my goal is to do a book review of all four of those characters, and but still maintaining both sides of the quote unquote argument, if you will. So C.S. Lewis, I want to read Jordan Peterson, William Lane Craig. So again, just trying to maintain the most neutral perspective while searching out all of these different ideas. But yeah, as far as Sam Harris goes, it was just kind of the natural progression that I would come across him.
I was wondering what you find out of, you raised a lot of, at the start you said there was a lot of negativity on this atheist internet aspect. And as much as I would like to say I engage in this kind of atheistic kind of debate on YouTube, I actually really don't. I spend all my time on YouTube watching football highlights. So this is kind of quite new to me. So in some sense, I was wondering, can you tell me a bit more about that atheist kind of internet aspect and the roles that the four horsemen of the apocalypse, well, not apocalypse, but atheism, play in it?
So really there's what you'll find if you start looking arguments for God on YouTube, for example, right? You're going to find a lot of men usually having conversations with either theists or even just creating content on their own, or they're reviewing somebody else's content. And it's a lot of, atheist takes down Christian and a lot of negative debates. And then you will find the more intellectual, study-based debates with people who actually know what they're talking about versus just some guy in his room. And I think that there are two ways to go about that. Again, there is the intellectual one versus just the angry young person online, right? And I was actually watching Alex O'Connor yesterday, and he had Rainn Wilson on Within Reason, his podcast. And Rainn Wilson actually said, yeah, I think it's quite useless, these types of arguments. I think that there is a good way that they can make some progress, but I'm trying to carve out this section that it's not just about apologetics versus anti-apologetics, atheism versus theism, that let's promote skepticism. Let's promote a positive, healthy search for the truth rather than just a fight online, because I think we can do better than that, honestly.
I was wondering what you mean when you say skepticism, I guess, because is it a skeptical atheism, a skeptical theism? How can someone be, because I could imagine someone being a theist who's also questioning these things in a similar way as someone who's a skeptical atheist, I suppose, in your with your language. How would you define yourself, or how would you define what skepticism should be in this landscape?
I think for one, I'm not an expert, so I don't think that
Mhm,
my word should be the final word. But I will say this from, again, my perspective. I'm really hesitant to use the word atheist because I
mhm,
feel that that's with the internet and with the culture and throughout history that carries a certain connotation. And if I were to approach this from an quote unquote atheist perspective, that gives somebody an idea about me before they get the chance to listen to what I have to say. I would say at the moment that I do fall along the non-believer or agnostic side of
mhm,
things, but that's not the end of the sentence. There's a lot more to explore there, and that's where skepticism comes in. Being skeptic towards different ideas and different beliefs, and the idea is that eventually I will find an identity for myself, but in this in between period, this is skepticism. I think that somebody that does currently have an identity that wants to explore elsewhere, if it is within their faith and they are searching for a certain denomination, or if they're thinking that they're kind of falling away from their faith altogether, that would also be skepticism. So I think it's this umbrella term of anybody questioning where they are upon the spectrum of belief to non-belief.
hmm. That's definitely something which I guess I could almost set. I share a lot of sympathies with that position
Mm-hmm.
because I mean I have loads of questions when it comes to things about faith, about Christianity, Catholicism, all these things, and sometimes it's very easy to fall into a comfort zone of our
Mm-hmm.
identity. And we almost not only define what our identity is by living it out, but also we try to find some security within the identity we
Yep.
have, and that leads to a very large comfort zone in this kind of realm or this echo chamber that we keep
Mm-hmm.
ourselves in. And you do raise a very interesting idea that I want to kind of touch upon a bit more. You talked about how this internet is always focused on, oh, atheist destroys Christian, and there's also a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
on the other side, Christian destroys atheist, and there's
Yep.
something somewhat inherently negative or toxic about this landscape. But almost underlying this, I guess, this polarizing picture, there is the idea of, well, people are just trying to figure out what's the correct argument, and if someone takes away all emotion from these, of course, unfortunately, emotionally charged terms, you get
Mm-hmm.
this argument's right, that argument's wrong. Let's see which argument's working out or which one's better. Would you say that you're looking at this perspective and you're saying, well, perhaps it's not really a purely argumentative or propositional debate, but rather there's also further things which come into a skeptical kind of mindset, or at least questions about faith. We should be thinking about things like meaning, things about value, things about
Mm-hmm.
narrative in general, which can't really be defined by one argument being superior to another. Would you say that's the approach you're getting at, or is that somewhat different from what you had in mind?
No, that's definitely where I'm coming from. I think that as humans, of course, morality and suffering and all of those things are extremely nuanced topics, right? And I think that collectively, all together, we are striving to find the truth. I think that's the ultimate goal of all of this, of the debates and the arguments and the literature and the YouTube videos and all of that. That collectively we are working to find the truth, and I think that that's the best way to approach it. I agree with you that we can't bring emotion out of it. We can't take our emotion out of it because it is, the ultimate question, right? Does God exist, or where do we get our morality and all of those things? And it's nearly impossible to remove the emotion from it. So I think that there is, like I said before, a healthy way to approach this common goal that we have.
Hmm. And where do you think, I suppose, morality and God tie in your kind of psyche or your worldview? Are they
Mm-hmm.
interchangeable terms? Or are they kind of intimately tied together? Because of course, historically, we have from Plato the idea of the good, the form of the good being tied directly to the ethical life, and then you
Mm-hmm.
have in the medieval period Aquinas kind of tying kind of natural moral law to God, and even a lot of people like William Lane Craig like to say, well, God is the good. There's this moral argument for God, but in
Mm-hmm.
like kind of, I guess, academia these days, in ethics, people try to kind of cast God completely out of this ethical landscape, and let's just look at ethics as ethics, and you get that in
Mm-hmm.
Kant as well a bit. But I was wondering kind of how those two concepts tied together. Do you view them as interlinked, or are they completely separate, or can they be separated?
I think that there's a spectrum, right? As somebody who I will say I am not a believer, I'm a non-believer at this point. I still think I'm a good person. I act according to the laws. I try my best to be a good person, and I think it would be unfair to say that you cannot have morality without God. Now, do you believe that perhaps God is working on me without my knowledge? That's something that I think could be argued, but I think that it's never something that could be mutually exclusive,
Mm,
at least with what we have nowadays. within the conversation. That's not to say the reality of the situation, but within the conversations we are having, it's very hard to separate God and the existence of God and morality as it stands.
So would you say that connection between God and morality is almost an inheritance we have from our culture of it being so interlinked or so tied
Yeah.
together? Would you say
Yeah,
that's kind of the push we
absolutely.
have?
Yeah,
Hmm.
for sure. And of course, I live in America, and we're one nation created under God.
Hmm.
That is something deeply ingrained into our culture here. And of course, living in the Bible Belt and all of that, it's something that at the time being cannot be separated. Of course, there's an argument to be made for the separation of church and state, which I do strongly believe in. But culturally, no, we cannot separate it at this time. But again, we can find a decent common ground.
Hmm. So I suppose taking a step or towards a more metaphysical kind of debate or discussion, I was wondering what you thought about, I guess, the connection between at least good as this metaphysical reality and
Hmm.
action. Is there a connection? Maybe let's not say God, because let's assume we're non-believers here and say,
Hmm.
well, okay, we believe in some ethical life. I'm a good person. When I say I'm a good person, do you think that ties into any sort of, I suppose, non-physical reality? So is there actually a form of the good like Plato which does exist, or is it more like a Sam Harris position, which, if I remember correctly, is almost somewhat hedonic in the
Hmm.
sense of, does it give us pleasure? Does it maximize pleasure in those ways?
Yeah, that's definitely a hard question to answer. Like I said before, kind of, is God acting on us? So we'll remove God from the equation, right? Is there a good force acting upon us, wanting us to act well and be kind to our neighbors? I would like to say that there is something intrinsically special about humans, that this is within us, right? But I don't think that's the whole truth. In the moral landscape, Sam Harris even addresses sociopaths and people that have a true mental disorder that doesn't allow them to carry that type of empathy that most humans are expected or wanting to have. So, sorry, I think that's just really a hard question to answer. I don't know if I have a good answer for you, honestly.
Hmm. No, that, yeah, it's definitely one of those very big questions, because I suppose if one then commits themselves to the idea that there is this good or this form of the good, the implication of that would then be almost, well, how exactly are we meant to define this good, or how are we meant to
Hmm.
support it? Because it's all well and good to kind of hypothesize that these things exist, but unless without that kind of justification, you fall back either to theism, or you're just postulating that it exists just because it exists because it's helpful in almost a Kantian sense.
Hmm.
But I was wondering whether, I guess, this morality aspect of things. I do like talking about morality because I think this is a very fascinating point. Do you find when you hear the moral argument for God, I suppose, presented by William Lane Craig, what's your initial reaction to it? Is it the idea of, oh, hold up a second, maybe I am not really good, or actually, hold up a second, when I say I'm a good person, maybe I am presupposing God? Or do you look at
Hmm.
it from the perspective of, I guess, this is a weird argument. I can see why it could work, but at the same time, I just don't buy it. What's the, I guess, psychology or the approach you have towards a moral argument?
Yeah, so I actually watched your tier list
Hmm.
ranking video for the arguments for God, and I think you put that one as S tier, right? So you thought
Yeah.
that it's
Hmm.
a pretty strong argument. My initial reaction upon hearing something like that is, I know that I'm a good person, and I
Hmm.
also know that I don't believe in God. So that's
Hmm.
my personal belief on that
Hmm.
argument. I also take from the perspective that William Lane Craig is a Christian, right? So
Hmm.
is it to say that anybody who's not a Christian or believes in another God is not also acting
Hmm.
morally, or are they just they're getting it from their god, or the real god is the one that they're actually worshiping, so that raises a lot of questions, and I think that really weakens the argument, because coming from his Christian perspective, is the Christian god the only one that provides for morality, and anybody that's not following that is not following true morality? And then again, I'm going in these circles in my mind, and then I get back to the place of, well, is God just acting upon us and encouraging us to be moral, and the non-believers or the people of other faiths just don't know it? And that's kind of where I land on that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting question, because when I was thinking about where to put the moral argument, I personally don't think it is a very, like, philosophically, I would say it's actually quite a poor argument. There's some problems within it. The question then arises, well, does it actually psychologically have that impact? And that's something I debate a lot, because I do hear some people who think, okay, that's actually a very good argument, but from some people like yourself, they're like, well, we actually have some reservations about the actual strength or its psychological impact on one's decision making. Though I was wondering whether we could perhaps go in depth into I suppose, the philosophical aspect of this moral argument, independent of its potential emotive states, to say, well, okay, from what I seem to be hearing from you, and do correct me if I'm wrong, your main criticism of the form of this moral argument is the idea that, well, people can be good without the existence of God, or without acknowledging the existence of God. I suppose in the philosophical sense, the proponent of the moral argument would say, well, yes, one can act good independently of one's knowledge of God, but the very definition of good, what it means to be good, and I guess this ties back to our previous kind of discussion on the metaphysics of good, the very concept of good itself, independent of our experience of it, has to be grounded in some sense of a divine reality. So by mere virtue of invoking the term good, you are indeed invoking the reality of God which underlies it. I was wondering what you thought about that argument, or that response was that, which may be different.
Yeah, I think, of course, it is a very important question. But as you were asking it, really where my mind goes to is, if we're behaving good, if we're behaving well, and like I said, treating our neighbor with kindness, does it really matter where it comes from? If it comes from a belief in God, or if it comes from this intrinsic feeling that I should be kind and I should be a good person. Not to say that it doesn't matter, but I think that in the end, of course, if we are behaving properly towards other humans, I think that we've done a good thing, to use the term, but I think that we've done a good thing. I think that it is an important question to find the answer to, but I think establishing moral behavior in the first place should be the goal. And of course, we can explore more of that after.
Definitely. And perhaps taking a jump back from this, I know I've somehow gotten into a deep dive into this moral question all of a sudden, but let's pull ourselves back out of it again. I was wondering what questions you approach apart from this kind of moral dimension of philosophy, and of course of religion. What other aspects are you wrestling with in your
Yeah.
readings?
Yeah, so of course, morality is the first one that comes up. I think it is the biggest issue, at least in my mind. But I think the God of, or the divine hiddenness, right? That's another argument, that if I never experience what I believe to be God, or if I can't see a direct interaction with God, how am I ever to believe? There's the God of the gaps then, right? So I can look at all of these other arguments and then just make the leap from one to another. Oh, well, this must be God. Then I prayed and something good happened in my life. It must be God. And that's really where I struggle, because at this point, I will remain skeptic, but if I don't ever get that divine interaction or intervention, I don't know if I ever will be able to believe. And I'm interested to know that, as somebody who is of the faith, what you would have to say to me about that.
I suppose the interesting question you have is, well, what is the success condition or at least the falsification of a divine hiddenness argument? And the reason why I ask that is because if we say, okay, well, God seems hidden, he appears that we cannot experience him. Okay, and then I conclude that God doesn't exist, or I don't have sufficient reason to believe in God. What's going through my mind is, well, okay, if I wanted to prove that argument wrong, well, actually, what evidence would I have to see? Is the only way I'm going to believe in God if God appears right in front of me as a human being and says, "Hi, I'm God." But if that's the case, I'll probably think I'm hallucinating, or I'll think, well, okay, I'll explain it with
Right.
natural experience, because if some guy walks up to me, I'll be like, well, that's just a normal guy. And if the guy walks up to me has wings, I'd be like, well, that might be an alien or something like that. So the falsification condition of that divine hiddenness might be somewhat in question. And also, I think there's also a question of, well, is God really that hidden, in the sense of, if you think about the arguments for God, yes, the idea there is always going to be a slight jump between, okay, I have this set of propositions, there's a conclusion, therefore that conclusion is God. There's always a jump. But in some sense, what I think is being done there with that jump is we're almost trying to separate the conclusion from, or we're trying to separate the word God from what it means, in the sense of, we're thinking, well, okay, God is omnipotent, omnipresent, whatever, right? And and we have this argument which gets some conclusion with those properties. But then when we're thinking about it, we're like, okay, we have these properties, but aren't those properties equivalent to God? Instead of saying, well, okay, we have these properties, that seems like God, and we're making another jump. We're just saying, well, those properties are what we call God. So it's almost, it's just a kind of, it's in the same way that someone might say 1 + 1, that's just 2, instead of saying we're making a jump from 1 + 1 to 2, if that makes sense. I'm not sure whether that kind of...
No, it definitely, I understand what you're saying, I think. And I think as a believer, of course, I have to assume that you have faith, right? So you constantly engage in these arguments, and you are fully aware of all of the arguments against God and for God. And what I am lacking is that faith. And that's kind of what I'm referring to as that jump is you look at all of those things, and then how you get from one to the next is the faith. And because I don't have that, I shall remain skeptic forever, I suppose, until something else shifts, and maybe I'll read something that I just cannot deny. Like I'm reading the Bible right now, right? Because I think that, again, if I'm going to engage in this space online, that's the fair thing to do. I am very familiar with the Bible, but I've never read it from cover to cover. But yeah, that's really where I land, is that I don't have that faith, and I think that that's really what it requires to go from step 1 to step 2.
What do you think faith stands for you? Because to some it's a leap of faith, to some it's a rationally informed decision, in the same way that I look at the ground, it's wet outside, I'm like, it probably rained overnight. And someone said, I had faith that it rained overnight, or it could have just been the gardener sprinkling water. What actually does faith mean to you?
Yeah, when I think of that in the example you gave, there's this televangelist that I've seen a commercial on that's selling like holy water or something, and he's just no, I don't know if you have that there, but we have these grifters that will make commercials, and they'll sell holy waters. You can buy prayers or stuff like that, and and the convincing argument he used is, when you get in a plane, you have faith that the plane will land safely at your destination. And it's like, well, no, that's not faith. That's based on scientific reasoning and evidence that I have, that over the however many years that we have planes in the air and the amount of hundreds of planes that fly every day, I'm pretty certain, based on the evidence, that my plane will land safely. That's not faith. That's an entirely separate thing. And to me, faith is making that gap of what is physically present based on scientific evidence and what is not, and the questions that can't be answered. And somebody like myself, I can't, in good faith, do that. I can't do that. I can't make a claim or believe in something. And that's just the way that I'm wired. That's the way that I believe. And of course, all of that comes from the knowledge that I have thus far. So while being skeptic, things can change in the future.
Definitely. And I was wondering, when you think about, I guess, that idea of hiddenness, and perhaps it goes to the first part of the discussion, apart from the kind of the leap of faith, but more to where God is in some sense. What would a condition, or I guess the question to you would be, what would that experience, if you were to experience God empirically in some sense, or scientifically, if you were to use such terms, what would that look like? Do you have any idea of what it might look like, or is it kind of, we'll see when that happens?
Yeah, I at this point, I'm very skeptic to believe that it could happen. When people talk about divine intervention, they talk about near-death experiences, right? And people come back and they believe in the Christian God, or there was an example of somebody coming back and speaking fluent Latin, supposedly, right? There's that, or there's divine experiences when people go to certain churches and they feel that I was really present with God, or when somebody takes communion or the Eucharist, they genuinely fully believe that, and they really truly believe that. So those are just examples of what people say they have experienced now. But for myself, I think there would need to be something pretty grand that would happen. But at this point, I'm so in tune with my own feelings. I would find it very easy to rationalize something to be, oh, well, I can easily explain this away as science or coincidence or anything like that, because I am so aware at this point of what, for myself, it would or would not look like. So yeah, it would take something really incredible for that to happen, I think. Yeah.
That's quite fascinating. And the reason why I say it's quite fascinating, I like to have some insight. I'll give you an example. So imagine there's this guy who is questioning about whether he wants to convert to Catholicism or not. And he's a very rational guy. He doesn't believe in superstitions at all. But one day he goes drinking a lot with his friends, And then one of the friends asks this guy, it's not, why aren't you a Catholic yet? You seem to be asking yourselves these questions, whatnot. And he says to this friend, well, I have some doctrinal issues about it. And then the friend replies to this guy and says, well, hold up a second. It's not always about doctrine. There's more to life in belief, or about anything, about any belief system, apart from the propositions which build the worldview up, because the worldview in some senses is a form of perception of the world we experience. It's not always about doctrine. And then the guy kind of forgets about it, goes to mass the next day, and then in mass he hears someone say to him over his ear saying, it's not always about doctrine. And then he looks around, doesn't see anyone there, and he's like, well, that's very weird. He's not rational, but he would experience, like he would have been able to bet his life on the fact that he did hear someone speak something to him. In this circumstance, what would you view as the different, I guess, psychological motives going on in this person's brain? Would you say, okay, that was just purely the fact that he was hungover because he was drinking the night before?
Right.
He's probably hallucinating. What would be those kind of, I guess, psychological motives in that situation?
I think if I were to be having a conversation with this person and he told me about his experience, I would, while remaining skeptical, be encouraging. I would ask him, do you feel that was God? And if so, I encourage you to follow along that, just to be a friend and to not discourage anybody, because that's not my goal. If that were me, however, and if I were to put myself in that position, like I said, I would be easily able to rationalize it. Like you said, perhaps I'm hungover, perhaps I'm hallucinating, or I need to go to the doctor now because something very weird is happening, or perhaps I'm feeling guilt. I said something not that kind to somebody this week, and I'm sitting there at mass and I'm thinking these things, and I, again, would be able to rationalize it. But going back to the question earlier about what would it take, I think that, and that's kind of my goal too, while attending different church services, is trying to find God if I can. And I would like to retract what I said earlier. Maybe it wouldn't take something that big. I think that my goal of going to these different church services and attending faith practices, that I am looking for it. But again, if that were me in that position, with that exact example you gave, I think I would be easily able to rationalize it.
And where do you think that rationalism kind of confronts the, I suppose, the real world experience that you have? Because in some sense, I'm almost inclined to believe that almost any certain circumstance that you experience in that situation could be rationalized. I mean, if I think about all the religious experience, well, not all the religious, I don't have many, but if I go through all the motivational or inspirational experiences I've had, either through reading or whatnot, I can mostly rationalize all of them in a very strict and simple way. Oftentimes, the reason why I go along with them is almost a belief that there is something more to that rationalism in life, to that experience and that. But then, of course, it's quite a fine line, because I can see very easily how that could kind of derail itself and you then become way more mystical than you probably should be. I was wondering how you balance that within yourself. Or is it really just a leap of faith in the Kierkegaardian sense to say, well, okay, it just happened, it is what's good, and that's how let's flow with it. I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that, not to put my own opinions onto you, but I think that is the faith. That is what's lacking for me. I allow myself to rationalize, and you allow yourself, or you don't allow yourself to rationalize, or you allow yourself to continue with the faith. And you have had what you say are religious experiences, and I fully believe in that. But what I think is that you are allowing your faith to carry that forward for you.
Yes, that's quite fascinating. And perhaps we could move on to a bit more of a kind of a broader discussion. I suppose if someone's skeptical and they're looking at these issues, there's always a very big kind of debate about where exactly they should be looking at things. I guess both from a theist and an atheist side. There's a few of my friends who kind of try to go into the deep end before they approach, I guess, the more popular level books like William Lane Craig and whatnot. And there's another few group of friends which just kind of go completely into the deep end and just kind of lose themselves in academic articles and stuff like that. I was wondering whether that balance between the academic articles and the popular level books have ever come to your mind, whether you thought you would be focusing on one more than the other, or whether that divide, or at least what role does that divide play with you in your mind?
Yeah, so actually the first book I picked up, I listened to God is Not Good by
Mhm.
Christopher Hitchens, or God is Not Great, one of the two. And I did an audiobook for that. And I was like, okay, these are pretty heavy subjects. I
Mhm.
think I should pick up a physical book to read. And the one that I picked up was The Portable Atheist,
Mhm.
with a foreword by Christopher Hitchens, in which he includes writings all the way back to the 1700s. And so I'm reading all of these different authors, and I'm like, whoa, like I'm
Mhm.
very out of my space here. So I went to school, but that was for sports medicine, right? I know that you're a
Mhm.
philosophy student. So I'm coming into this with, not much knowledge on how to even approach these types of subjects. And that was part of my decision going into my channel, that if I'm going to be spending time with these books and learning these different ideas, that I need to really get it and really understand it. So right now I'm starting off, I've kind of backpedaled, and I'm coming to the more simplistic ideas, or things that are easier to understand. I would like to one day get to true philosophy and the great names. But right now I am starting off with the more, like you said, like pop books. What's popular right now, what's a little more digestible, because as somebody that's coming into this new, I think that that's the smartest way to go about it, that I don't want to get in, go into the deep end too soon before I understand the basics. And that's also why I'm reading the Bible, that I think that, again, before I'm able to fairly formulate any ideas, I need to understand the source material.
Hmm. That's definitely very fascinating because I mean, I this is one of the biggest debates I have in my mind all the time is
Hmm.
actually what impact does academia actually have on people's beliefs? Because
Hmm.
there's always this funny quote that we always kind of share around Oxford. It's like, you write a paper, 3 people read it. You write a popular level book, loads of people read it. In some sense, the popular level books are what impact the world and
Yeah.
are what is meaningful in this world. And I was just wondering, I guess, whether you think, from your perspective, whether there is a need to actually go beyond this kind of popular level kind of discussion to that which is beyond, or I suppose whether there is any value in that kind of engaging with the deeper material. And if so, is that a universal value, or is that just for individuals, I guess?
Yeah, I think it depends on what your goals are. If you want
Mm.
to be a best-selling author and you want to make a bunch of money, well, I think you know the way that you have to go about it. If you're really searching for the truth and you want to do the research and dig into the old text, I think that you know which way you have to go. That way, I think that for the sake of ethics and science and religious studies and all of these things, we have to have the people doing the tough work. We can't just give up and say, well, somebody wrote a book back in 1780 and I think they found the answer and we can just follow that. No, we have to continue, and we have to continue having this conversation. But in order to bring that to the general public and to people like me who are just now coming into this, it does serve a purpose to have people writing the books for the general public, so that we can begin to be a part of the conversation as well. So I think both are important. It just depends on, if you're the one writing, what your goals are.
Hmm. And and tying back to, I suppose, the atheist kind of internet, you talk quite a lot
Hmm.
about, well, you talked very positively about Alex O'Connor, and I really respect Alex O'Connor. I have a very
Hmm.
funny anecdote with Alex O'Connor, but that need not be shared necessarily. But there's what sides, perhaps on the Christian side or the theist side, do you also have kind of that sympathy to? If there's like an Alex O'Connor equivalent of Christianity, who would that be, or what are some resources
I hate to say it, but I don't really have an answer for that.
there?
I'm still doing my best to broaden my horizons of the type of content I engage with online. And oftentimes it will lean more towards the atheist side of things. Um, that will be my next goal. I will find somebody that I appreciate and like what they have to say. Now, of course, if I come across somebody, I did find this video because I recently went to a Greek Orthodox church, and that's what my next video is going to be about. But it was a Baptist preacher or Protestant who interviewed a Greek Orthodox priest, I believe. And so it was theists, two believers of different denominations. And I thought that was a really wonderful interview. So I wish I had his name, but I think if it were to be anybody, it would be somebody that is positive, that is approaching it with a respectful perspective. So yeah, I will find somebody for sure.
So, how's your experience been going to these different Orthodox, these Catholic services? What
Mhm.
has been your engagement with these different denominations?
Yeah, so I think so far I've been to the Catholic Mass, I've been
Mhm.
to the Greek Orthodox, I went to a non-denominational. They say it's non-denominational. It really is Baptist based
Mm.
on their actual doctrine and teachings. But so far with the two that I have visited, I thought it was really great. I thought it was something that was so different, even though they are preaching from the same book, or they're teaching from the same book. Wildly different experiences. I definitely felt that there was something special there, and it felt separate from the secular world. And that's where you bring in the question, was that God? I don't know if it was God. I think it was a great experience and something very cool to witness as humans participating in something ritualistic and all is one, and even when they're speaking in a separate language. And that's really hard to find in the secular world. I can go to a rock concert, I can go to a football game or something like that, and see humans participating in something together. But to see humans participate in something that is meant to be so divine and in tune with God, even as a non-believer, it is a beautiful thing to witness.
And what were the differences between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Latin Rite? Was it a Latin service?
I don't think so. No, it was the entire thing was in English. I don't know the exact separation between the two, but based on the comments of the video that I did post, I didn't go to the Latin Mass. I went to a more modern mass,
Probably a
from
Novus
what I
Ordo
believe.
Mass, yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I think it was. So yeah, it was pretty different. The Greek Orthodox, the Divine Liturgy that I attended, first of all, it was an hour and 45 minutes long, so it was much longer. They had incense that they included in the Divine Liturgy. They had a choir, so at the Catholic Mass, we would have the priest say one thing, and then we as the people in the congregation would respond to them. But they had an actual choir that would do that kind of for us. I think we could participate if we wanted to, but they were set aside to say specific things. And what I thought was so interesting is that they also spoke in Greek. So it wasn't just English, it was also Greek. And of course, there was the communion as well, but they had, I believe, bread baked by members of the church that had been blessed. It wasn't just, I know, like in the Jewish faith, you can get the different bread, and with the Catholic faith, you can get the blessed crackers that are pre-made, I suppose, but they actually made the bread there. So I thought that was cool. Yeah, so it was similar in theme, but execution was very different.
Yeah, it's one of those fascinating things, the difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism of the more liturgical services is definitely a very unique divide. And I was just wondering whether when you go to those services and you do talk about this extra experience, can you describe a bit more about it? Because I suppose when I went as a Baptist to a Catholic Mass, I knew the doctrinal differences, but I didn't really, I mean, what they meant to me is probably very different from what I guess as a non-believer going to a Mass or going to a liturgy. What would you describe that, apart from, I guess, it being non-secular in some sense?
Yeah, I think that what I've learned is really the whole goal of Divine Liturgy or of Mass is to receive the communion. So from my outward perspective, I realize I'm missing out entirely. I'm not getting what the goal of the Divine Liturgy is to have that direct interaction with God. So I'm missing out on that entirely. I think that if I were to speak from the perspective of a believer, I would say that that is a much more holy and God involved experience versus a non-denominational church, which some will say is like a Bible study, right? You have a preacher on stage and he's walking you through the scripture, and then you're kind of talking over it and he's relating it to your life. So it's very much like a Bible study, but the ritual and what is actually being done in the Mass and the Divine Liturgy is something that is entirely separate from that.
Splendid. And perhaps to slowly wrap up this video, are there any questions that you have for me, or at least kind of, I guess, different dimensions or perspectives that you'd be interested in?
Yeah, what I find really interesting, because I've looked through your channel, is that if as I learn more, I question more. I become more skeptical the more I learn. And I'm really curious as to how you can land upon Catholicism with all of your knowledge and with interacting with all of these different philosophical ideas. Maybe that's going back to what we discussed earlier. It is your faith that permits you to do that. But if you would like to answer, I am curious about how you find your identity in Catholicism while also educating yourself on all of these other ideas.
That's actually quite an interesting question. One of my I suppose my knowledge and my reading, saying my knowledge just sounds horrible, but my reading, through my
Hmm.
reading, I kind of try to separate the theology reading from the philosophical reading, because I mean,
Hmm.
if you watch some of my videos, you notice I'm very much on the existentialist kind of 19th, 20th century, Nietzsche's, Heidegger's, Dostoevsky's. That's
Right.
kind of the realm I'm leading in, and in that sense, it would be in some ways very contrary to the Catholic worldview, just because that whole movement is very much about self-defining, self-affirmation. How do we
Hmm.
interpret ourselves in a world in which there is no meaning at all, no prior structures? How can we as humans engage with that world? So in some sense, that's quite separate from a Catholic worldview. I mean, in some sense, through reading those thinkers, you do recognize how difficult it is to, I guess, from my personal experience, how difficult it is to carry out this kind of will to power, this self-affirmation without this framework. Sometimes you recognize, well, at least for me, I've recognized the difficulties of doing that, and having done that myself, sometimes that can be quite difficult, and therefore I guess that motivates me towards something which does provide that framework. But from the theological side, and purely from the theological side, I would say I choose Catholicism, less so because I thought Catholicism was the correct one over Orthodoxy or Protestantism. I just felt either Orthodoxy or Catholicism had the fullness of the faith in comparison to Protestantism, in
Hmm.
regards both to the fact that both of them were older, and I really take Christ saying to Peter very seriously, not necessarily on this rock I shall build my church, but rather that the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And to me, if the Protestant claims were correct, and that Protestantism was so correct in its statement of Catholicism and Orthodoxy's problems, and those criticisms were true, then, well, it would seem to me that the gates of Hades did prevail against the church, which would then falsify Christ's own commandment and declaration to Peter. So to me, the truth just had to lie somewhere between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And to me, the easier accessibility, the easily accessible nature of Catholicism
Yes.
as someone from the Western world instead
Hmm.
of someone from the Eastern world just made me think Catholicism was the right way to go, I think. And also the fact that it allows, in some sense, not necessarily for the development of doctrine, but an evolution of belief is
Hmm.
something which I think is almost an inherent nature to Christianity, which is necessary, because in Orthodoxy it's very much stuck in the 7th century with the last
Hmm.
councils, whereas Catholicism allows for that development, and there's this richness of development in relation to the time. So I think I would say that's probably why I choose, I would say, Catholicism over Protestantism and Orthodoxy. Yeah, and yeah, that's probably answers that question.
Yeah, yeah, I really appreciate that, and I think you obviously have thought a lot about this, so I appreciate understanding how you're able to learn all of these things, but keep that separate from your actual faith and theological beliefs. And I think that I will say this: if I were to believe, or if I find myself in a state of belief, I think I would also go the Catholic route. Just from my experience and what I see, I think that I agree with you that it is the oldest faith, or one of the oldest faiths, and the way that they practice is rooted in history. And I think that in America, especially, and where I live, especially, that the Protestants have really changed things a lot. They've shifted a lot from what the original practice was supposed to be. So I think I would find myself in the same place as you are if I were to get to that point.
Yes. Well, it's always very fascinating with these things, and denominations especially. Everyone, I do wonder, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Is I do wonder whether denominations are as much a psychological thing as they are a doctrinal thing, in the sense
Hmm.
of maybe someone in America might based on their background and their psyche and their culture, it might just so be better for them to undertake this kind of Protestant Southern Baptist. I don't I struggle to say ritual, but this
Hmm.
worship, whereas someone in the
Yeah.
East might, just due to the nationalism of their countries, like the individual national churches, like the Eastern
Yeah.
Russian, the Russian Greek
Hmm.
Orthodox, and I suppose in the West, Western Catholicism kind of balances those two extremes together. So I was wondering,
Hmm.
from your perspective, how much of that psychological aspect, when you say, "Oh, I probably would be Catholic if I was to be a Christian or a
Hmm.
believer," how much of that do you think is dictated by psychology, and how much is that dictated by doctrine or belief?
I think it's really heavily cultural. Like you mentioned with the Orthodox Church, they have nationally related churches, right? So even if you are Orthodox, you could find yourself in a Greek Orthodox or a Russian Orthodox church, which is, you can acknowledge, it's purely cultural, right? It's purely
Mm,
national. So I think that here, and I struggle to say this because I don't want to be insulting, but I think that it's a lower cost for entry for
mm,
Protestantism, for baptism. It's pretty easy. You don't have to do much. You can just show up on a Sunday and sing worship songs and listen about the Bible, and then you get to go home. There's no true requirement of learning the doctrine and participating in confession and communion and really being a part of that. So I think that the low barrier for entry is what encourages people for that. And also, I think that the amount of time that individuals have to offer to faith. I think that here in America, it's a very strong work culture and a work centered culture, and that with something that is a low barrier to entry, such as Protestantism and a Baptist church that you go for an hour and a half, one day a week, that's the best way for people to, I've heard before, get their Jesus in, right? So they'll do that because that's the easiest way to do that. And I think that it's up to the individual, and I think that it definitely is psychological and cultural over paying attention to the true doctrine. I think that somebody like yourself that moves from the Protestant side of things into the other, it's because you did the work, because you did the research, and that's what I want to encourage as well, as somebody who would be a believer, that that's the best way to go about things, is not just to find the easy route, but to make sure that what you're participating in is what you truly believe in.
mm. Definitely, and I think that's a brilliant way to end off this interview or this discussion. Thank you very much for coming onto the channel once again. If you want to watch more of her videos, make sure you check it out in the description below. And I'm looking forward to what churches or experiences you have next on the channel. Thank you very much for coming on once again, and have a great day. God
Yeah,
bless
thank
us.
you.